Chapter 3. When Edric and Dr. Entwerfen reached Sir Ambrose, they found Father Morris at his side, explaining with his usual promptness and clearness the meaning of the different signs of the telegraph. "My dear Edric," exclaimed Sir Ambrose, throwing himself into the arms of his son, "my dear Edric. Your brother has gained the battle. The Germans are completely overthrown. He has taken their king and several of their princes prisoners, and the fine province of France is ceded to us entirely." "I am rejoiced to hear it," cried Edric, returning his father's embrace with emotion, "and he, I hope, is safe." "I hope so too," replied Sir Ambrose, "though he says nothing of himself. But you know, Edmund, our troops won this. Our army gained that. The soldiers fought bravely. He never speaks of himself. To hear him relate a battle, nobody would imagine he had ever had anything to do with it. Convert by https://ikindlebooks.com. "It is too dark to see any more," said Father Morris, who had been for some time watching the telegraph, and now turned from it in despair. "The machine is still in motion, but it is too dark for me to decipher what it means." The attention of all present was directed to the sky as he spoke. It was indeed become of pitchy blackness. A general gloom seemed to hang over the face of nature. The birds flew twittering for shelter. A low wind moaned through the trees, and, in short, everything seemed to portend a storm. "Had we not better return to the house?" said Dr. Entwerfen, looking round with something like fear at these alarming indications, for his heated imagination had not yet quite recovered the effect of the awful speculations he had so lately been indulging in. "What is that black spot there? I declare it moves. Good heavens, what can it be?" "Really, Doctor," returned Abelard, "you provoke the action of my risible faculties. That opaque body which you perceive at a little distance, and which seems to have occasioned such a fearful excitement of your nervous system, is only a living specimen of the Corvus genus, who has probably descended upon earth to search for his vermicular repast." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Abelard," rejoined Mr. Davis, speaking with his usual precision, "but, according to my humble apprehension, you labor under a slight mistake as to that particular. The feathered biped that has so forcibly attracted your attention appears to me not one of the corvi, but rather one of the graculi, a variety of extremely rare occurrence in this vicinity, and which are sometimes called incendiae aves, from their unfortunate propensity to put habitations in combustion by picking up small pieces of phlogisticated carbon and carrying them in their beaks to the combination of straw and other materials, sometimes piled upon the apex of a house to defend it from the inroads of pluviosity." "It is of no use," sighed Sir Ambrose, still straining his eyes to endeavor to decipher the movements of the telegraph, the outlines of which only now appeared, stamped as if in jet, and strongly relieved by the dark grey sky beyond. "It is of no use," reiterated Father Morris, and the whole party were preparing to retire, when suddenly a vivid light flashed upon them from the hill, and instantly a long line of torches seemed to stream along the horizon. "He is coming home, but will write more tomorrow," exclaimed the whole party simultaneously, for all knew well by experience the meaning of that signal. "He is coming home," Thank God, repeated Sir Ambrose, his pallid lips quivering and every limb trembling with agitation. Look to my father, cried Edric, he will faint. Oh no, no, repeated Sir Ambrose, thank God. Thank God. Lean upon me, at least, said Edric, affectionately. Sir Ambrose complied, and, supported by his son, still gazed anxiously on the torches, their red glare shading an unnatural light around them and making the surrounding darkness only appear still more intense. Thunder now growled in the distance, and rain began to fall in large drops, yet still Sir Ambrose gazed upon the torches, and could not be persuaded to leave the terrace. These wild, fearful-looking lights, gleaming through the tempest, seemed a connecting link between him and his darling son, and it was not till they were obscured by the thick heavy rain, and even the outline of the telegraph vanished in the gathering clouds around, that he could be induced to seek for shelter. Sir Ambrose slept little that night. The sleep of age is easily broken, and perhaps the joyful agitation of his spirits had produced a slight access of fever. He rose with the dawn, and, long before the rest of his family had descended, summoned Abelard, that he might dispatch him to inform his most intimate friend the Duke of Cornwall of the news. Go, said he, as soon as the drowsy butler made his appearance. I am sure the Duke feels nearly as great an interest in the success of Edmund as myself, and will not be displeased if he be disturbed a little earlier than usual upon such an occasion. I obey, replied Abelard. I will shake off my somnolent propensities and speed with the velocity of the electric fluid to the castle of the noble chieftain. Take heed you do not forget your message by the way, repeated Sir Ambrose, smiling. Not all the waters of Leith could wash such somniferous tidings from my memory, replied the butler. Your honour's words are imprinted upon the mnemonic organ of my brain, and my sensorium must be divided from my cerebellum ere they can be effaced. The Duke of Cornwall had been the intimate friend of Sir Ambrose almost from infancy. They had been companions at school and at college, besides which peculiar circumstances which had happened in their youth had linked them together in indissoluble ties. What these circumstances were, however, no one exactly knew, except the parties concerned, and they always avoided alluding to them. All that was generally understood upon the subject being that Sir Ambrose had, in some manner, been instrumental in saving the Duke's life, but how, when, or where, was never clearly explained. The Duke of Cornwall was of the royal family of England and closely allied to the throne. His father had been brother to that prince who had so steadfastly refused the crown when it was offered to him by the ambassadors from the people, and as that prince had left no male descendants, the Duke might be considered as legitimately entitled to reign. The thought of disturbing by his claims the female dynasty now established had, however, never entered into the mind of the Duke, who, with half the sense of his friend Sir Ambrose, possessed, at least, 10 times the obstinacy, and having taken it into his head that he would marry his daughter Elvira to Edmund Montagu and his niece Rosabella to Edric, he turned all his thoughts, plans, and wishes to the accomplishment of this object, and suffered no other idea to interfere with it. Those, however, who were acquainted with the characters of the young people, thought the Duke had quite reversed the natural order of things by this arrangement, and that the strong mind and haughty spirit of Rosabella would have suited better with the ambitious Edmund, whilst the soft yielding disposition and feminine graces of Elvira seemed to harmonize exactly with the taste of the philosophic Edric. No persuasions, however, could induce the Duke to deviate in the slightest degree from his design. Like many of the higher classes of society in those days of universal education, he affected an excessive plainness and simplicity in his language, so much so, indeed, as sometimes almost to degenerate into rudeness, in order that it might be clearly distinguished from the elaborate and scientific expressions of the vulgar, and when urged upon the subject of these intended marriages, he would roughly say, "Don't talk to me, there is nothing like a little contradiction in the married life." If two people were to agree to live together, who were always of the same opinion, they would die of ennui in 6 months. No, no, I am right, and so they'll find it in the end. He would then shake his head and put on such a look of positive determination that his friends would generally retire in silence, feeling it perfectly in vain to attempt to alter his resolution. As to consulting the inclinations of the young people themselves, the idea never entered his imagination. "Children don't know what is good for them," he would reply sharply, if any one presumed to suggest such a thought, "and it is the duty of parents and guardians to decide in such matters." Sir Ambrose, wishing the connection for his sons, and respecting even the whims of his friend, had as yet never interfered, and the young people had also appeared silently to acquiesce. Rebellious spirits, however, were hidden under this apparent calm, and the Duke was soon to learn from experience that human beings were rather more difficult to manage than a drove of turkeys or a flock of sheep, a fact of which before he did not seem to have the slightest suspicion. The Duke had already risen, and was in his garden, when the messenger of Sir Ambrose arrived panting for breath, and quite exhausted by the velocity which, as he expressed it, he had employed in endeavoring to execute with the utmost expedition the implied wishes of his master. The Duke was surprised to see him. "What brings you out so early?" Abelard demanded. He, "Oh, your grace," replied the butler, gasping for utterance, "the haste I have made has impeded my respiration, and the blood, finding the pulmonary artery free, rushes with such force along the arterial canal to the aorta that I am in imminent danger of being suffocated." "Pshaw," said the Duke. "Besides," continued Abelard, "a saline secretion distills from every pore of my skin, in a serous transudation, from the excessive exertions I have made use of." "And what has occasioned these violent exertions?" "The earnest desire experienced by Sir Ambrose to transmit with all the expedition possible to your grace the intelligence he has just received of the acquisition of a victory by Master Edmund in the hostile territory of Germany." "Victory!" shouted the Duke. "Victory, Rosabella! Elvira! Where are you, girls? Here is tidings to rouse you from your slumbers. And how is he, Abelard? Is the brave boy safe himself?" "God bless him! Victory will be nothing to us if we are to lose him." "It occasioned me excessive chagrin," replied Abelard, "that I am totally unable to resolve that interrogatory to your grace's complete satisfaction." Taciturnity, however, upon some subjects, is, I believe, generally considered synonymous with prosperity, and as Master Edmund, to the best of my credence, conveyed no information relative to his sanity in the communication made by him to his paternal ancestor, I humbly opine that there are no reasonable grounds for supposing it has suffered any material deterioration in consequence of the late sanguinary encounter in which he has been engaged. The Duke had not patience to wait the conclusion of this speech, but hobbled away as fast as his infirmities would permit, vociferating for Elvira and Rosabella in a voice that might have silenced Stentor and Abelard, finding himself alone, was fain to follow his example, marveling as he went along, however, at the excessive impatience of the fiery spirits of the age, which would not permit people to remain stationary, even to hear what he called a compendious replication to the very questions which they themselves had propounded. Whatever faults might fall to the share of the Duke of Cornwall, that of a cold heart was certainly not amongst the number, and the delight he felt on hearing of Edmund's triumph could not have been greater if the youthful hero had been his own son. His eyes, indeed, absolutely sparkled with transport when he communicated the intelligence to his niece and daughter, and his tidings were not bestowed upon insensible ears, for the breasts of both his youthful auditors throbbed with pleasure at the news, though the causes of their emotions were different. Elvira had been the idol of Edmund's homage from her childhood, and she fancied she returned his passion with equal fervor. But she deceived herself, and love was as yet a stranger to her heart. Endowed with great beauty and superior talents, accustomed from her earliest infancy to be worshipped by all around her, surrounded by flatterers, till even flattery itself had lost its charm, Elvira was as yet insensible to love. Why she was so, we leave to philosophers to explain. We merely state facts and leave others to draw conclusions. Rosabella's character was essentially different from that of her cousin. Passion was the essence of her existence, and her dark eyes flashed a fire that bespoke the intensity of her feelings. She loved Edmund, but though she loved him with all that overwhelming violence that only a soul like hers could feel, yet she would not have scrupled to sacrifice even him to her revenge if she had thought he treated her with negligence or contempt. She scorned the opinion of the world, and regarded mankind in general but as slaves, whom she should honor by trampling beneath her feet. Ambition, however, was her leading passion, and even her love for Edmund struggled in vain for mastery against it. This feeling was now highly gratified by the tidings of Edmund's victory. She triumphed in his glory, and a deeper glow burnt upon her cheek from the proud consciousness she felt that she had not placed her affections upon an unworthy object. "We have no time to lose, girls," said the Duke. "I would not miss being with Sir Ambrose when he receives his letter for kingdoms. Here, Hippolyte. Augustus, get a balloon ready, and let us be off directly. How tedious these fellows are. They might have removed a church steeple in the time they have wasted about that balloon." "If your grace would have a moment's patience," said Hippolyte, holding the cords of the balloon. But his grace had no patience. It was an ingredient nature had quite forgotten to put into his composition, and without waiting For the ascending ladder to be put down, he sprang into the car in such haste. The moment the balloon was brought to the door, that he was in imminent danger of oversetting it. So, said he, very well. That will do, and now, girls, that you are safely embarked, we will be off. Hippolyte, you will steer us, and Abelard, go you into the buttery, and let my fellows give you something to eat. You will want something after your fatigues. There, that will do, don't let us hinder a moment. And the rest of his speech was lost in air as the balloon floated majestically away. It has often appeared very astonishing to me, said Abelard, after watching the balloon till it was out of sight, to observe how partial great people are generally to an aerial mode of travelling. For my part, I think the pedestrian manner infinitely more agreeable. De gustibus non est disputandum, replied Augustus, the Duke's footman, to whom this observation was addressed, but I think I observe symptoms of lassitude about you, Mr. Abelard. Will you not adjourn to the apartment of Mrs. Russell, our housekeeper, to repair by some alimentary refreshment the excessive exhaustion you have sustained in the course of your morning's exertions? Willingly, Mr. Augustus. I own candidly, I feel the want of a little wholesome nutrition. I shall, besides, be extremely happy to avail myself of the opportunity fortune so benignantly presents of paying my respects to Mrs. Russell, whom I have not seen these 3 days. The worthy housekeeper was equally rejoiced with Abelard at this instance of fortune's benignity, a sort of sentimental flirtation having been going on between them for the last 30 years. She accordingly stroked down her snow-white apron, readjusted her mob cap, and smoothed her grey hairs, which were divided upon her forehead with the most scrupulous exactness, before she advanced to welcome her visitors. What will you take, my dear Mr. Abelard, said she, as soon as he was within hearing. What can you fancy? I have a delicious corner of a cold venison pasty in my pantry. Words are altogether too feeble to express the transports of my gratitude at receiving so gracious an accolade, beauteous Eloisa, replied the romantic butler, for thus, in allusion to his own name, was he wont to call her. But, though you had only the rigors of the Paraclete to invite me to, instead of the comforts of your well-stored pantry, still would words be wanting to express the feeling of my bosom on thus again beholding you. Spare my blushes, said Mrs. Russell, casting her eyes upon the ground, and playing with a corner of her apron. I feel a roseate suffusion glow upon my cheeks as your flattering accents strike upon the tympanum of my auricular organs. Oh, Mrs. Russell, sighed Abelard, gazing upon her tenderly. Then, after a short pause, he continued, as to the aliments with which your provident kindness would soulage my appetite, though venison be a wholesome viand, and was reckoned by the ancients efficacious in preventing fevers, and though the very mention of the savoury pasty makes the erepti, usually employed in secreting the mucus of my tongue, erect themselves, thereby occasioning an overflow of the saliva, yet will I deny myself the indulgence, and content myself simply with a boiled egg, as being more likely to agree with the present enfeebled state of the digestive organs of my stomach. You shall have it instantly, cried Mrs. Russell. And will you have the kindness to superintend the culinary arrangement of it? Yourself, rejoined Abelard. I do not like the albumen too much coagulated. And I prefer it without any butyraceous oil, simply flavored by the addition of a small quantity of common muriate of soda. The egg was soon prepared and devoured. Thank you, dear Mrs. Russell, said Abelard, this refection was most acceptable. I had felt for some time the gastric juice corroding the coats of my stomach, and still, though I have now given it some solid substance to act upon, I think it would not be amiss to dilute its virulence by the addition of a little fluid. Have you any thing cool and refreshing? I have some bottled beer, replied Mrs. Russell, but I am afraid the carbonic acid gas has not been sufficiently disengaged during the process of the vinous fermentation to render it wholesome, and there is scarcely any alcohol in the whole composition. That is exactly what I want, said Abelard, for my physicians have expressly forbidden stimulants, provided the gluten that forms the germ was properly separated in the preparation of the malt, and the seed sufficiently germinated to convert the fecula into sugar, I shall be perfectly satisfied. I can guarantee the accuracy of its preparation both with regard to the malt and the beer, repeated Mrs. Russell, and the frothing fluid soon sparkled in a goblet, to the infinite satisfaction of the thirsty butler, who, after a hearty draught, vowed nectar itself was never half so delicious, and that all the gods on Olympus would envy him, if they could but taste his fare and see the blooming hebe that was his cupbearer.